Hey folks, figured I would check in because it's been a little while. Not to make excuses, but it's been a busy few months for me. I guess since the start of the year, I moved to a new apartment in a new part of town, so that's significant. You can imagine that took up quite a bit of time. I was keeping up on dev projects though. Earlier in the year I did join a couple of game jams. Maybe I'll do videos about those down the line a little bit. And I kept plugging away on my most recent pico-8 project, which is the fun little snowboard guy. I wasn't totally idle or totally divorced from development projects, but to be honest, I was feeling a little bit down on my progress or on the amount of time I had been spending on dev projects. When I thought back to previous updates, specifically with regard to the snowboard game, it didn't really feel like I had managed to change all that much recently, and that didn't feel good. Like, it felt like I had been neglecting my hobby. But in preparation for making this video and sort of like releasing a new version of the work in progress, I did load up the previous version of the game, and I was actually pretty shocked by how different it felt. I'm gonna get into the details, but yeah, just putting the old and new versions side by side made me realize that all of the sort of chipping away that I had been doing actually had made quite a bit of difference and made the game like more fun in its current state. And that made me feel good. I do want to talk about this new version, which I'm tagging with version number 0.4. That doesn't really matter unless you're super into the meta of Radical Slice projects, but what was notable about this tag for me was it was the first time that I set out to work on a new version with a clear theme in mind. I recognize this is going to sound a little bit silly and probably pretentious, but it was like sort of something I did just to guide the time that I was spending on the project. The theme that I had in mind was, it should feel like you've gone somewhere. I mean, not like you. This isn't VR. I mean, snowboard bro here. I wanted it to feel like snowboard bro, you, started at the top of a mountain and went to the bottom of the mountain. And that you went through different places and that the environment changed and that you felt like you had gone through like an actual connected place. I want to talk about how I approached that goal and whether or not I feel like I even accomplished it, but first I want to just like hammer through some of the new game mechanics that I've added since the last version, and we'll even do a deeper dive on one of them and talk about how it's been coded up. But before that, my name is Eric, and this channel is where I document my attempts at making games. This is Radical Slice. So what's new in version 0.4? Well, just at a glance, the most obvious addition is we've got 2 lanes now. I gotta confess, I started this project planning to just push the excitebike ramp angle mechanic as far as I could. And I do think there's still some fun directions I can take that, but in between the ramps, which again are the core mechanic, you're kind of just chilling. Like, there's nothing to do. You're just going forward, waiting for the next ramp to show up. So I wanted to sort of squash that dead time with something else. I experimented with some ideas here. At one point, I even had a trick system built in. Like, you could do tricks. It was fully implemented. I mean, it was simple, but it worked. It was there. But it didn't like feel right. At least the version that I built didn't feel like it fit really. So I pulled that out and put it aside, and eventually just thought, hey, I've already stolen the ramp thing from Excitebike. What else can I steal from Excitebike? Well, Excitebike has lanes and little obstacles that slow you down in the lanes, unless you dodge them. So maybe I can try that. I added the lanes in and the obstacles, and now there's just like a lot more going on. Dare I say, it feels more exciting. And even without the obstacles, it is kind of fun to just change lanes. Like, in between ramps, when I have some idle time, I find myself fiddling with the lane changes, even when there's nothing to dodge, just to like do it because it's fun. Making the little dude zip up and down is cool. Like, I just like it, so I'm keeping it in there. The other significant change I made is when you're boosting, if you screw up a landing, your boost will be interrupted. In the previous versions, if you were boosting, you were basically invincible. So there was no reason to not be boosting all the time. The goal here, though, was to push forward a little more on the game having these 2 sort of modes of travel. One is moving at normal speed, and it's easier to predict where you're going to land, and then you can plan your landing angle and react more. but you're racing against the clock because you're moving more slowly. The other mode is when you're boosting. It's harder to plan the landings, but again, because the game is on a timer, you're progressing through the level more quickly. So you make that trade-off of like harder landings for the sake of finishing the level before the timer expires. I think this change of having some additional risk when boosting sort of like, again, further differentiates those two modes of travel. And that like felt like a little corpo speaky, but like, I hope you get where I'm going with this. Like the two modes should feel different. Boosting and not boosting, they should kind of feel like slightly different variations on the game mechanics. So that about does it for the mechanics. Before we move on to programming time, though, I want to talk a little bit about game feel, because like I said at the outset, this version had a theme I was aiming for, a pretentious little theme. It should feel like you've gone somewhere. It should feel like you started at the top of the mountain, you went down a mountain, you saw some stuff, right? So how did I approach this? I want to talk a little bit about that. The first thing I decided was I wanted to add a new level right at the beginning that insinuates visually that you're at the top of the mountain, or that it's the beginning of the day or whatever. I don't know if you know this feeling, but sometimes when you're snowboarding and it's sort of early in the day and you're up at the top of the course and it's not really bright outside yet, maybe the sun's behind some clouds, snow's kind of blowing around, it's a little chilly, a little windy. That's kind of what I was trying to capture here. I played around with making the sky gray, but I couldn't make it look right yet. So for now, I'm just sticking with blue. Again, the sun's like behind some clouds that I drew. I added some snowflakes, and you'll notice the only background is the sky. You can't see trees, you can't see other mountains. And so I wanted to simulate or like hint at like, this is the top of the mountain, you're too high up to see other stuff because of the angle. And the second thing I changed to sort of relate to that was I updated the title screen, right? Which is like before the first level. So your dude here should appear to be at the top of the mountain, at the top of the mountain. I guess that's the summit. I guess we have a word for that. So again, just to add some sort of consistency in between starting at the title screen, progressing into the first level, it should feel like you're moving through one relatively seamless environment. Speaking of seamless, I wanted to make the level transitions feel more seamless. So it felt like one level is like physically directly connected to the next level. Before each level started and ended with a little like flat section, like just a few seconds of intro or outro so you could orient yourself, I changed this so that they both start and end with a downward slope. And which makes sense, you're on a mountain, you're moving downwards, right? But now because the start and end of each level connects, like it feels like your player is traveling downward into the next level. I also added a vertical screen wipe to sort of like tie things together, but also cheat because I need to change the background and I don't have a good way to do that yet other than just throw a wipe up there and now the new background's there. I feel like these changes make the levels feel a little bit more cohesive and get closer to what my theme was. Like, again, it should feel like you've gone somewhere. And I think that there's still plenty of work that I can do here. And I'm gonna keep the theme not just as a target for the version, but as a target for the game itself in general, so I can keep making changes in that direction. Do I feel like I totally accomplished my goal that I set out for this version? No, definitely not. But I do feel like, again, I got closer. Like I feel like having that sort of guiding principle helped me decide where to spend my time, which was, let's make these levels feel like they tie together. How do I start addressing that? So for all you code freaks that were waiting around for the code part, let's do that now. So there was one thing that I left out when I was describing the mechanic updates and the game feel updates. You know how in racing games with the timer, when you run out of time, it's not like you usually don't just like slam to a stop, right? The timer hits 0, your car or your player or whatever will start to decelerate and eventually you stop and then it's game over. But if you're close enough to, say, the checkpoint or to the end of a level, you can actually cheat a little bit and you can skid your way to the end even after the timer's expired. Like as you're decelerating, you're still within the possibility of finishing the level. This is another one of those cool little, I don't know if you want to call it a mechanic or just like an element of the game that fits into that category of it's fun because it feels like cheating. Like it feels like you weren't supposed to be able to do the thing. But you did, right? So you sort of like you defeated the game in a way. I'm really a fan of this mechanic in other games, and I wanted to put it into mine too. So let me talk about kind of how I went about the implementation. I know we all love diagrams, so I've taken it upon myself to draw a diagram to visualize what's actually happening here before we go look at the code. We can talk about which entities are at play, the messages that they're sending each other, and how that sort of creates that nice little deceleration, stop, game over screen thing. So the first thing that's going to set this all off is, of course, the game timer, right? This is all beginning with like that little timer in the upper right corner that says, okay, there's no time left. So let's just draw some sort of icon for the game timer. Next is going to be, of course, the player. We need the player to do some stuff. Specifically, we need the player to slow down and come to a stop. So let's draw something to represent the player in our cool diagram. Next, we actually need another timer mechanism to allow us to do that sort of pause in between when the player stops and when the game over screen is displayed. So I drew the game timer in that scary red color with the zeros on it. So let's use like a different kind of icon for this other timer. It's not as nefarious. It's also invisible. Probably a stopwatch looking thing is fine for this. And we'll just call this guy like a sleep timer, because it's going to cause the game to sleep for a second or two before we change to the game over screen. And finally, we want to have some sort of top level game state manager. Kind of think of it as the main game loop. Essentially, like there's some top level functionality that is deciding whether or not we're going to display the title screen, display the main gameplay screen, display the game over screen, etc. Right? Somebody needs to make those decisions. So we can think of it as like the game loop or the game manager. Let's draw like a loop icon for this. Okay, radical. So these are the four, again, entities, the four things in our game code that are going to interact with each other to allow this to happen. You're probably like, man, just to make a player slow down and stop takes 4 freaking objects. It's like, you could probably do it simpler than this, but there's a reason I want to break it down this way. I just think in order to demonstrate clearly all the various things that need to happen, it's easier to split it up into 4 pieces. What happens to set this all up again is the game timer reaches 0. So what you could do is just in the game timer code, set the player's velocity to 0. That's kind of a drag though. Like we don't necessarily want player code all up in the game timer code. So rather than do that, we're just gonna have the game timer code sort of broadcast a message. It's gonna send some message to anybody who cares that the timer has expired. And in this case, the player is gonna be listening for those messages. So let's draw that message in here. We've moved from the game timer to the player. The player needs to take some action here, so the player is going to slow the heck down. In order to visualize that, we'll put sort of like a loop icon to say like the player is acting on itself. It's not broadcasting any information yet. It's just like doing some action to itself. We'll call this decelerate. Okay, so the player is going to decelerate. It's going to take a little bit of time, and eventually it's going to reach velocity of 0. And after that happens, we want to display the game over screen, but first we want to have a little bit of a pause. So the player knows it needs to tell somebody that it has 0 velocity. So again, we're not going to say like, hey, display the game over screen, or hey, start a timer to maybe display the game over screen. All the player's going to do is just say, yo, team, my velocity is 0. I hope you know what to do about that. Okay, and in this case, the entity that cares about this player message is, of course, this sleep timer that we defined before. So the sleep timer is going to see this message from the player that the velocity is 0, and it's going to say, I know what to do about that. I'm going to start myself. So I'm going to wait 2 seconds now that I know the player has stopped. So just like we drew for the player, we'll draw a little loop here for the sleep timer that just says like, you know, update self or wait for 2 seconds. How about that? After the sleep timer has timed for 2 seconds, it expires, and it needs to tell the world that it has expired. In this case, the only part of the world that cares about this expiration is the game loop, right? Because the next thing we want to happen is we want to display the game over screen. In order to avoid mixing game manager logic in with the timer logic, again, all we're gonna do is just send a message. And we're just gonna send a message to the game loop saying hey, timer expired. Okay, and we need to finish this up soon because I'm running out of screen real estate. Let me draw in some boundaries to help make this a little bit more visually interesting. Okay, and now the game loop sees this timer expired message, and it knows oh shoot, when I see that message, it's time to display the game over screen. So let's get that game over screen up there. So that's the long and short of it. We have the game timer saying that the time has expired. The player catches up on that communication. It starts to decelerate. When it reaches 0, it announces to the world that the player velocity is 0. The sleep timer, the sleep timer sees that. It starts itself and counts down for 2 seconds. Then it announces to the world, hey, I've expired, if anybody cares. And of course the game loop cares about that, and that's when the game loop displays the game over screen. Let's have a quick look at the code to see how this all sort of ties together. Now, like I've mentioned before, I wrote a really simple sort of event bus or event queue system for my games, and we can see the events that I was just describing in MS Paint over there. Here, these bottom 3 events. So the first one that happens is the time over, which is the game timer expiring, and we have defined a handler function from the player called player handle time over. So let's go look what happens there. We would expect that the player would start to decelerate when we get this event. So let's have a look. And here's our function here, and that's exactly what happens. So you can see I've set DDX is acceleration. So I've set a negative acceleration here, which means the player will start to slow down. I also cheated and stole some of the code from another function because we also want the player to stop boosting. And I have some logic about the boost stoppages in this handle expr boost function. So I just kind of called that function here. I cheated a little bit. So again, we're going to wait for the player to decelerate completely, and we would expect that the player stop event would be fired. So let's see if we can find where the player is creating that player stop event to tell the sleep timer to start counting down. Here's the logic that's going to fire off that next event to start the sleep timer. I added a little conditional here that is looking at the player's acceleration to see if it's less than 0. The reason I added this conditional is because there are times when the player's velocity could be 0 that don't correspond to this pre-game over state. As the game currently is, there's no case where the player's acceleration is negative, except for this case, right? So we added a little check here just to make sure we don't accidentally fire this event. But when the player finally reaches kind of not 0, but pretty close to 0 velocity, we force it down to 0. And then we add this player stop event to the queue. And this should eventually find its way to the sleep timer. We can see here there's this, I didn't call it sleep timer in the code, I called it the timer manager, but there's a handle player stop function that's going to intercept this event and do what it needs to do. Let's go have a look at that function now. Nothing too surprising here. All we're doing is initializing our pre-game over timer. Again, it's not like the sleep timer, but it's pre-game over for 2 seconds. And we'll know that this will kind of update itself and count down independently. And when it's done, we should expect to see that it fires off that final event, which we've called here pre-game over expiration. So let's say 2 seconds have elapsed. It creates this pre-game over expiration event, and that's going to be intercepted by this game manager. That's the game loop guy. Handle pre-game over expiration function. It's like a long function name, but what are you going to do? So let's have a look at that and see what that does. And here we go. Again, nothing too, elaborate here. it does what it says it does. We have these two update and draw function pointers that determine what game logic and what game screen are being run and being displayed respectively. When we see this event from the sleep timer, we know that it's time to display the game over screen, and that's exactly what happens here. We change to the update game over logic, and we change to the draw game over screen. So yeah, 0.4. There's no sound yet. I'm working on that, and if I was a betting man, I would bet that version 0.5 will probably have some audio of some kind. I don't know how much yet, but something. I've got a couple more things cooking, a couple of videos in the old video oven, so stay tuned for those. If you're into this sort of thing, you know, like the video, maybe subscribe. But even if you don't, I want to thank you and say that I appreciate you and I appreciate your time. I know that your attention is valuable and you spent it on this video, and that's super cool. Thanks so much. I have been Eric. This has been Radical Slice. I will catch you again soon.